All right, hey everybody, welcome back. Tonight we're going to talk about juice treatments. So this is typically something done pre-fermentation. This would be like any clarification that you do to juice and additions that would be made to help with that process, right? If you'd like to follow along and you have the Principles and Practices Winemaking textbook, this is outlined in Chapter 3, Preparations of Must and Juice. Lovely. Okay, so we talk about juice treatments. We'll split it up into two parts. One is clarification, and then two will be additions that can be made, right? So clarification, it's the removal of suspended particles in juice. This can be really helpful because it can facilitate your downstream processing, right? So it can help clean up the product before things get it'll basically snowball at the end, right? They have a lot of things to take care of, right? If you just take care of it in the beginning, you can help that process along, right? So you do have to be careful with clarifying. If you over clarify a juice, you can actually strip it of the nutrients that the yeast needs to successfully ferment. So here we have a picture of a white juice. So this was before fermentation, right? We took it through a filtration system. We're able to take out a lot of this cloudiness and then start with a clear product. This will also be something that we utilize at the end of fermentation before bottling as well to get a clear product cosmetically for the glass that looks nice. Okay, so how is cloudiness, right, measured in wine? What is the difference between here, and how did we measure it? Well, cloudiness is also referred to as turbidity, right? How we measure turbidity is with a nephelometer, and it measures turbidity in NTUs, which is short for nephelometric turbidity units, oddly enough, right? So NTUs. So this is a way to make sure or to measure clarity in your wines. This will be really helpful down the road if you end up going into like filtration or stability of wine. You can actually measure the amount of turbidity or NTUs in your product, and it can help you determine what level of filtration that the pads that you utilize can maintain or like work with that amount of NTU, right? So if you have high levels of NTUs, like very turbid like this, it's going to be very difficult to filter that through a very fine filter. So based off of that calculation, you would know, okay, well, I'm at 400 NTUs. I need to start off with the coarsest filter possible. My wine's has a high turbidity. There's going to be a lot of stuff in there that could plug my filter right away, right? And then also I've worked for a couple of wineries that's had like requirements on NTUs for like white and rosé wines before bottling. Oftentimes, like I've had the consulting winemaker tell me that it needs to be below 1, or for rosé it needs to be below 1.5, something like that. Those are just requirements from the the owners / winemakers for more of a cosmetic reason more than anything else. A lot of wines nowadays are actually not being filtered, and people are just fine with it. So we'll just see where the industry takes us, right? So, but here is a 2 NTU, so very low turbidity, very clear product. And then as we get more NTUs, becomes more cloudy, more turbid as a product. Okay, so how can you clarify juice, right? In class, we utilize just natural gravity settling. We put the carboys into the fridge. All of the particulate parts will sink down to the bottom because they're more dense than the juice, and then the clearest product will be at the top, right? You can also clarify juice through centrifuge, through filtration, and flotation. And I have a nice little link here to Vintessential Flotation for Clarification video, which is very helpful as well. So, natural gravity settling, very common practice. Kind of like what we saw in class, where when we racked our white wines, we had this kind of sludge on the bottom that's known as lees. So like even before fermentation, this sediment will fall to the bottom. It's just whatever pulp or dirt or sediment was in the process that happened there. it will sink to the bottom naturally. Then you can rack it off, you can pump off this juice and then put it into a new container and then start your fermentation from there, right? So this will happen very naturally. It will help aid the process if you refrigerate the product, right? You don't want it to start fermenting on its own, because once it starts fermenting, it'll stir everything up, and then it'll be much more difficult to get a good separation, right? So think about that. For centrifuge, you may know centrifuge from your science courses, and we typically work with very small versions in that setting. In the winemaking world, there are very, very large centrifuges that can help spin and remove particles from juice. It does have some downfalls because it can aerate your juice, and it can be a little too aggressive. It can also strip too many solids from your juice and make it very hard for your yeast to ferment because the nutrients have been taken out, essentially. If you'd like to see a video on centrifuge separation, I do have a YouTube link for that here. And then here's essentially what the massive centrifuge in a winery looks like. Pretty crazy stuff. Next, we have filtration. Generally speaking, when we do filtration of juice, it's usually a rough filtration. Juice is difficult because it's so viscous, right? So after fermentation, we'll do a finer filtration on a finished wine, but in the beginning, we do a rough filtration, right? And that also makes sense, right? Because we know that juice as a product, when it comes in, has high turbidity, so you need to do a rough filtration in this case. Here's a picture of a red wine, or what looks like potentially cranberry sauce or some kind of thing, put into like a cheesecloth situation for a rough filtration. So it's just a visual aid to help you keep in mind it's a rough filtration. The picture of the filter here is a plate and frame filter. This is a system where you set up sheets of filter pads, and then they get squeezed into the plate and frame, and it develops a seal, and then the wine gets pumped in, and it's forced across those sheets as a filtering process, and then it comes out the other side as a filtered clean product. So that's a plate and frame filter for you. Very common in the industry. Another method is flotation, and I have not had the pleasure of doing this, but I think it is awesome. I would love to do it someday. So instead of letting your solids settle to the bottom of the tank through gravity, you can actually bubble it and float it to the top with nitrogen, right? So interestingly enough, the suspended pulp becomes attached to the bubbles, and then it becomes removed from the surface, right? So a couple of different ways you could do this. You could utilize flotation in a tank and then pump out the juice underneath it until you get to the sludge. Or if you had a way to remove the sludge, like scooping it off the top in a smaller tank situation, you could do that as well. Of course, this is primarily used for white and rosé wines, right? For reds, it'd be very difficult because you're working with skins as well. This is much faster than waiting for the juice to settle, and then you can start your fermentation right away. So super helpful, very efficient, and a quick turnover. So enzymes are also required. It helps to increase the speed and efficiency of the separation. So very cool product. I know for a fact they utilize this a lot in Germany. I haven't seen it here in the States, but I've only worked at so many wineries so far in my career. So very cool process. Would love to do it someday. And here's a video. Okay, and then here's just another image, kind of outline of what would happen, right? So we have a wine press that will take the grapes and turn it into grape must. It'll squeeze it to get the juice. The juice goes through a rough strainer, right, to get like the big particulates out. Then it gets pumped into a tank with gelatin and other enzymes. That becomes pumped full of nitrogen gas. It will push all of the waste up into a froth up to the top of the tank, and then you can pump out the clean must and then ferment it somewhere else and then clean up all your waste afterwards. So very cool process. Okay, so now I'll move on to additions. There are things that you can add to your juice to clarify it from the get-go, right? And that is bentonite, PVPP, and activated carbon. Bentonite is actually a clay formed by the weathering of volcanic ash. It is a very effective I want to say reagent that we use in winemaking. It helps a lot with heat stability. It helps to separate out any of the gunk and to like clarify your product, right? So it is very helpful, right? The interesting thing about bentonite is that when it becomes rehydrated, there's a lot of minerals in bentonite and they're negatively charged. And because they're negatively charged, they bond to all of the proteins in your juice, which are generally positively charged, and then it just removes that whole situation from your wine, right? When you prepare these reagents, it's really important that you do it exactly as the instructions say. Otherwise, it won't be effective. You'll waste product and you'll waste money, right? So the procedure for rehydrating bentonite is to use water, turn it into a slurry, mix it as well as you can, and then add that slurry to your wine. It won't be effective if you just add it straight or in cold juice or in clumps. Will not be very effective at all, right? Typically, if you're using it for clarifying, you'll add it at the very beginning of the winemaking process to a white or rosé specifically. You add it before the yeast so that the bentonite can start clarifying the wine as it's fermented. You can either do it that way or you can add it and let it sit for a day, let it sink to the bottom, rack the juice off that bentonite, and then ferment it from there, right? You don't have to ferment it with the bentonite in there. Okay, PVPP, this is a secret weapon of the wine industry. PVPP is an acronym for polyvinyl polypyrrolidone, which could be an awesome Google password if you could guarantee you spelled it right every time. This is a very fine powder. It's a synthetic, right? It's related to like PVC, basically. You're not going to be drinking this, so don't worry. When we use this in wine, there's absolutely none left. We filter it out, so you don't have to worry about anything leaching that's unhealthy in your product. It's highly effective at removing compounds that can turn your wine brown, right? It's used to prevent and treat oxidation in all types of wines. It can also be used to reduce bitterness and prevent pinking in wine. If you're curious what pinking is, I have a link to the Australian Wine Research Institute here. And pinking is actually what happened to the wine in The Judgment of Paris, that Bottle Shock movie. So it showed that the bottles turned brown, the Chardonnay turned brown. That actually wasn't true. It actually turned pink. Because when you have a white wine that's in contact with its skin, there are compounds in the juice that are capable of turning color, right? And they come together and then they form a color and then the color leaves. So it's a reversible reaction, but it's a phenomenon called pinking. So watch Bottle Shock, and you could see how that happened, right? So a little more about that from the Australian Wine Research Institute. A fantastic resource for just winemaking in general. Check out the website. They have a lot of information. It's free. It's an open resource to everyone. So highly, highly, highly recommend. Okay. Next we have activated carbon. Activated carbon, you probably have heard about this or seen this in some kind of dental commercial or something like that, right? It was all the rage. People were putting on all sorts of things to remove the color, right? Which is crazy, but activated carbon is a very severe and a non-specific fining agent. So that just means it just strips everything. Carbon wants to bind with everything. That's why it's so efficient. So if you're going to use activated carbon in a wine, it would remove everything, essentially. It would remove off odors, off flavors, any color problems, right? But if you left it in for too long, you would essentially be left with just alcohol and water in a glass. It would literally turn it white. It would look like nothing. It would taste like nothing. And it would be a very sad day. Unless you wanted to make a seltzer or something like that. That could be something you could do. But generally speaking, activated carbon is used in only really extreme situations. And I would recommend just avoiding it in general. And I'd also recommend not putting it on your teeth. But I'm not a dentist, and you can do whatever you want. I have a link here from ATP Group about activated carbon, specifically in the world of winemaking. So if you'd like to learn more about that, you can check that out. Okay, and there's a lot more finding information to talk about, right? We'll talk about how to remove bitterness, how to enhance mouthfeel, how to protect a wine from a protein haze, how to protect it from crystals forming. These are all finding agents that we'll talk about later in the semester, so don't worry, we'll get more into that. This presentation was just focusing on the things that you can do and add to your juice before fermentation starts, so don't you worry. Okay, and with that being said, we have our review questions. A shorter presentation today, but still helpful information and valuable, in my opinion, to the class. So I hope you guys enjoyed. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. But otherwise, I look forward to seeing you guys next time.